Nice to see everybody. We are getting towards the end of a really, really interesting couple of days, and this is going to be an incredibly interesting conversation. First of all, just before we get into the conversation, I just wanted to caveat that we're going to sort of move the conversation beyond the CSRD narrative that has been dominating the compliance part of this conversation. And the reason for that is we want to talk about sustainability beyond just the compliance part of it, so beyond just the ticking of boxes. That's where the real value is to be found, and that's what we're going to dig into. So that's one elephant in the room that we're going to deal with. Can I pass over and ask you all to introduce yourself for a couple of minutes, please?
Thanks, Illana. My name is Rupert. I'm the CEO and founder of the Disruption House. We're a data and analytics business. We profile ESG performance and disclosures of mid-market and SME firms where there is the biggest data gap, because many of those firms are not yet engaged in a sustainability journey and reporting because they lack knowledge and tooling to do so. So we'll talk a little bit further about the drivers for that in a minute. But I think the key bit is we think of ourselves as really, if climbing to sustainability excellence is equivalent to climbing Mount Everest, you need a Sherpa to take you from base camp to the top. Our focus is on getting everybody to base camp, because if we get everybody to base camp, we've made a significant impact on the world. So that's us.
Thank you.
Hi everybody, I'm George Sandilands. I'm the Vice President of Carbon Accounting and Decarbonisation, so important word missing there off the board, but there we go. So my job at Sage is to help. So Sage, as a background, financial and accounting software, over 2 million customers globally, and we're in the process. So my introduction into Sage, I previously ran a climate tech startup called Spherix, which was acquired by Sage about 3 years ago, which is effectively brought in carbon accounting capabilities. So we integrate with Sage software, Xero, QuickBooks, and there's a manual entry journey to effectively help small and medium-sized businesses with climate action, starting with measuring their carbon footprint and moving on to taking action with that. And in terms of where we are today, sort of by the end of the year, we're going to be providing as a part of Sage Customers package, carbon accounting for about 500,000 businesses in the UK. So we're hoping to make a really big dent in starting in the UK and then rolling out globally. So that's why I'm here. I'll pass over.
Hi everyone, I'm Nicole from Phillip Morris International. I'm Head of Sustainability Stakeholder Engagement for PMI. I've been with the company for about 15 years. The first 10 years I worked in a finance and strategic planning role, and the last 5 years in sustainability. First looking at how we manage our non-financial data and our reporting, and then moving over probably the last 2 years into a stakeholder engagement role. This is my first time at London Climate Week. It's been really constructive. Actually, the last couple of days I've had a lot of great opportunities, conversations to meet with other companies, understand how much they're progressing, what the challenges are. And I think I'll probably leave Climate Week here in London feeling quite refreshed and optimistic that despite everything that's happening in the world and all the headlines, there's a huge community of very talented, gifted, and ambitious people and leading companies that are continuing to make progress in the area because they see it as a business imperative. And so there was a stat I heard yesterday actually for London Climate Week. There's twice as many events as there were last year for the London Climate Week, and 3 times as many participants. So I think that's a good data point to show that there's still a lot of momentum behind the topic.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Richard Lumley. I'm the Chief Risk Officer with responsibility also on financial risk, compliance and financial crime at a bank in the UK called FCMB Bank UK. As part of a much bigger Nigerian banking institution. I've been around the block. I've been to big banks, small banks. I've been working with Disruption House at a couple of banks over the last couple of years. I'm currently at FCMB. I actually have a prescribed responsibility given to me by the regulator actually on climate risk, so I have to take that very seriously, but we also engage with the regulator on ESG matters too, so I can give you some insights on that perspective if the questions arise. Thank you.
Thank you. So as I said, we're going to move the conversation beyond the CSRD. So just for those that don't know, CSRD is corporate mandated reporting on the environmental and social impacts. It's taken up an awful lot of the conversation up to this point, certainly over the last couple of years, in regards how organisations mobilise themselves towards a sustainable future or a resilient future. Rupert, because of that narrative around CSRD and that mandatory reporting, a lot of the focus has been on those large mandated companies. Can you talk to us about the importance of SMEs within this space, please?
Absolutely, Illana, thank you. So I think CSRD is a very important thing to remember, and the EU Omnibus is still not settled as to how many firms will ultimately end up reporting, whether it be 1,000, 3,000, 10,000. Originally, it was designed to capture 49,000 of the largest corporations in Europe. But there's still something like 1.8 million businesses in Europe who are selling into those 49,000, 10,000, 3,000, 1,000. I was attending a panel earlier this morning, and one of the world's biggest drinks manufacturers has 30,000 suppliers. So the reality is that, if there's 1,000 firms or 3,000 firms that are caught by regulatory reporting, there's another, 10x, 100x firms who are going to be delivering into those firms, like Philip Morris. And as Philip Morris is reporting, they need transparency on what those smaller firms are doing. And I think because, we see what firms are doing at the moment, we were just looking at one sector. There's quite a lot of climate tech here this week, obviously, because we're on the Climate Action Week. In the tech sector, the difference between firms about 5 to 20 million turnover and 20 to 50 million turnover is that firms in 20 to 50 million are doing about 60% more on sustainability than those in the 5 to 20 sector. So I think what you see is a significant capability and reporting gap as it goes down the curve. And as George was pointing out, there are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of SMEs who are caught in that supply chain engagement, who data is required from. And if someone's not doing something and they're asked for data, they'll give a big fat zero. And it's not the impact they're having, it's just the data they have. And that doesn't help people actually move forward. And I think one of the things we've seen that's very interesting and is related to sort of beyond compliance and resilience is that the political landscape has given an awful lot of firms permission not to do something. And what we've seen over many years is that there's a lot of research that shows that firms that actually have a better ESG score are a better counterparty risk. They're a better credit risk. They claim less in insurance. So now what we're seeing is the big firms are actually looking at ESG purely as risk data in terms of who is a risk to me. And I think historically it might be thought, who's a risk as a supplier? But now it's actually who's a risk to lend to insure to. So I think doing nothing is no longer something that is anything other than damaging your business, but a lot of people still don't know that.
Yeah, 100%. It's a really, really interesting landscape that we find ourselves in at the moment. Nicole, elephant in the room. Can a tobacco company even be sustainable?
Thank you for the question and for calling out the elephant in the room. I think, it's maybe a surprise for some people to be at an event during London Climate Week, sustainability event, and see someone from a tobacco company on the panel. Sometimes that can make people even feel uncomfortable. And I think, it's not always the most intuitive connection for someone if they're not familiar with PMI and our business transformation that we've been undergoing. And I think to answer your question, I guess we first have to take a step back and ask, what do we mean when we use this word sustainability in the first place, right? So what does it mean for a company to manage their business in a sustainable way? For us, it's all about materiality. So if you're a business and you can take a look at yourself and you can say, what is my footprint? So where are my factories? Where are my offices? What is my supply chain? What am I sourcing? Who is working in my supply chain? Who is working in my operations? What are the products that I am selling? And then looking at that entire footprint and saying, okay, from an environmental perspective, from a social perspective, what are the biggest impacts that I generate? What are the biggest risks and opportunities to me and my business? And if you can follow a very structured and methodical process to do this evaluation, and then distill what are the most material issues for you as a business to address, this is what it means to be managing your business in a sustainable way. If we apply that lens to Phillip Morris, it is quite clear to us, and I hope to everyone that's here today, that the most material issue for Phillip Morris to address is the health impact of our products, right? Conventional cigarettes. And that's why, for more than 10 years, our company has been undergoing an absolutely significant transformation, shifting away from conventional cigarettes, actually aiming to make them obsolete. A few years ago, our CEO was in an interview and he said, cigarettes belong in museums. And so this is this really intentional, purposeful approach to address that product health impact is what we are doing. And how we are doing it, since 2008, we've invested over $1 billion or $14 billion in developing and commercializing a portfolio of smoke-free products. So what these products are, they're products that allow adult smokers who would otherwise continue, not quit smoking and continue to use nicotine, to do so in a way that is at a much lower risk to them than conventional cigarettes. Today, the progress that we're making, we look at fiscal year 2024, just under 40% of our revenue came from smoke-free products. And we always compare that to our baseline year of 2015, when we really say that's kind of the start of our transformation, and we had zero of our revenue from these products at that point. So in this time frame, it's a significant shift that we have achieved, and by 2030, we aim that 2/3 of our revenue will be from this portfolio. And if you look at the decline in cigarette volumes that we've achieved in that same period, so 2015 to 2024, it was roughly 28% decline in cigarette volumes in the same period. And so obviously it's not just about the products that we sell. If you look at our materiality assessment, climate is also another material topic. So I'm very happy also to discuss all of the programs that we have to address climate change. We have a net zero by 2040 target, and I'm happy to discuss that also today, because I think that's a topic on the kind of top of many people's minds.
Thank you, and I appreciate your honesty, thank you. I think it's really important when we look at sustainability, we frame that in what we're trying to achieve with it. I've been in sustainability for 20 years. What we're trying to achieve for me is very simple. Does it change the outcome for my daughter or not, and all of the children that we love? When we look at this narrative of just good and bad companies, we lose that ambition, because we need to take every organisation, every region, every department, every individual on the journey with us. We have to all achieve it, or none of us achieve it. We can't leave just some of organisations not getting there. So we need to look at all of the impacts and who is making strides to reduce theirs. And this is why the greenwashing legislation that we've had most recently is so important, because it really helps us to, well, first of all, it helps the market to not be skewed by misleading information. And secondly, it helps us to understand what does good look like in this new paradigm world that we're moving into, where we need to consider such huge complexities as biodiversity, water, individuals, and how climate is going to affect them and their transition. Thank you. So I just think it's really important, and this is why we wanted to have this conversation about beyond compliance, because compliance in and of itself, which we will dig into, can distract us from the outcome that we need to have. You can be compliant and still have a negative impact. Many organisations are focusing on compliance and not their biggest material impacts, which is the thing that will create these catastrophic tipping points of which it will be difficult for us to return from. So with that in mind, with the data, George, could you give us some insight into what you're finding with the clients that you're working with, and also are there any maybe obscure or unexpected trends that you're seeing with the organisations?
Sure. So our mission is to help small businesses decarbonise. Very specific mission. in that, right now, from a compliance perspective, right now there's no mandate at all for SMEs to do anything about climate change, really, if we're being totally honest. In terms of regulatory drivers, that is. The drivers are coming from supply chains. The drivers are coming from, actually, in a lot of cases, talent. You know, a lot of Gen Z, the young people, do not want to work for firms who are harming the planet. That's massive. So Sage has about 45,000 accountant customers, so accountants who manage financial accounts on behalf of small businesses. And a recent survey showed that there's a massive retention problem with younger staff, whereas in the small cohort of accountants that we work with in an early stage, because one of our philosophies is that accountants are going to play a major role in carbon accounting, and we're beginning to sort of train up accountants with the tools that they need to provide carbon accounting services and other sort of environmental disclosure within their practice. But the one thing that we found is for those companies who are adding that side of sort of carbon to their brand ethos, they're attracting younger workers much more easily. So there's right now in terms of the data, there's a huge amount of levers available to those firms.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and I'm really fascinated by the SME movement to change and whichever levers get them there. But again, without the SMEs changing, we have a huge part of our GDP not changing. So it's really, really interesting space. Thank you. Richard, can you explain to us, you mentioned your sort of fiduciary responsibility in changing, but what was the driver? Was it compliance-led, or was there more driving you to move into this data analysis and materiality risk?
So from our perspective, there's from a regulatory environment, they've been interested in climate risk for quite a long time. That's why you have these prescribed responsibilities. And when you sit down in front of a regulator, they will say, what are you doing around the climate risk agenda? They kept promising that they're going to articulate more on the ESG agenda. I think that's still work in progress. And for us as an organisation, it was important for us really to understand where are we regarding ESG and sustainability, and where do we want to be, given we're a very small bank in the UK. We have a lot of conflicting priorities. So you talk about operational resiliency, financial resiliency, outsourcing, third-party risk management, and the general risks that we run. So you've got to balance that off against, as you said earlier, the proposition as a firm and the credentials as a firm that you have on ESG, not only for your outside stakeholders, it's your customers, it's your employees and your employee proposition. Also, what we're seeing is, and getting a little bit techie here, I was quite interested to see a change in rating methodology by an Italian rater on bonds, and they've actually brought ESG within their rating criteria. So if you see it in the future, if that's being driven forward, then you're likely to have your ratings impact, and that would mean that your actual price of credit would go up potentially if you have a poor outcome on ESG, and will go down vice versa. We've also championed certain deals, and you mentioned about tobacco. If you think of tobacco, cigarettes in the West, you have all these negative connotations. But if you talk about tobacco farmers in a particular country in Africa trying to make a living with tobacco for a whole range of products, you have a different ESG criteria to it. So you have to look at it from that lens as opposed to, say, the end product. So we're seeing it growing in importance. Having said that, the problem we have, I think, today is really the prioritisation on everything else that we have. So as I said, outsourcing, operational resiliency, all the general risk management and financial resiliency at the end of the day. And the regulator is obviously interested in all these aspects. And the one area I'd say at the moment they're not really pushing is the ESG one. I'd like them to be pushing harder, because that gets a lot more focus and attention potentially as well. But it does feed into our prioritisations, because if one of our key critical parties is to be compliant, to be appropriate in terms of our regulatory posture and position, and with other risks like cyber as well, it is very difficult to perhaps raise that level at board level to say, it's really important we do ESG, it's really important we do all the other stuff as well. So I think it's really critical. So we won't, for survival as an organisation, we recognise we have to change. We're driving that through the culture agenda, and ESG is also forming part of that.
Yeah, and how do you find the acceptance of that more broadly across the organisation? Is there, not just your organisation, but just in general, do you find that there's pushback on that, just as an interest?
So I think I was on a call the other day, and we sort of mentioned it's not all about, or an article, it's not all about the White House and what's going on with the US political situation. We're seeing on the broader agenda, I think ESG is important. It's important to our parenting group, and they have a lot more capacity to take on this work. So they have a team looking at that. Our challenge in the UK is how can we best utilise the resource the parenting group have in Nigeria and leverage off that. So we're not, one, duplicating on effort, but two, they've got greater capacity. I think from our perspective, our concern is they will enforce, say, a reporting framework on us as opposed to engaging as chefs. We'll get a food critic approach rather than a chef approach. That is a worry to me. And I think from our perspective, and Rupert mentioned it, I think counterparties are more differentiating on these data points and ESG positions as well as the standard, are you financially resilient?
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting.
Can I just add something there?
Please do.
Actually. So I think picking up Richard's point and particularly sort of going beyond compliance and performance. So one of the benchmarking partners that we work with has been benchmarking discretionary wealth management portfolio performance over many years, and they are used by asset and wealth managers when they're pitching to clients to manage their money about, I have performed above this risk rating index, etc. One of the things that we do is actually measure the sustainability of asset and wealth managers as a house, as opposed to in the product. A lot of the focus has been on the product portfolio, but people have often forgotten that the houses themselves are actually in the ecosystem and making a difference to the culture and the things, and longevity of staff. What was really interesting when we looked in the questionnaire of what drives performance, there were a couple of questions that were so linked to sustainability. One of which was, how often did you end up in an employee tribunal in the last year? And the other was, how many customer complaints did you have? Both of those things are actually fundamental in terms of customer engagement, employee engagement, like that sit within the existing pillars of ESG. So I think what is lost often is that actually getting these things right delivers performance in so many different ways in terms of actually delivering better value from your investment, because the house itself is more stable, its staff are not walking out the door, it respects its customers. And those things are so crucial, and they're not a tick-boxing exercise. They are actually about embedding these things in your organisation because they deliver better businesses.
Yeah, indeed, it's value creation of the future, isn't it? And or now, but looking into the future. I'm really interested within that frame to understand if we take it beyond compliance, what risks are we starting to see impacting our organisations or our ecosystems within our organisations that might not be the priority compliance thing, but is definitely impacting? Nicole, shall I start with you? I'd love you to talk about water, by the way.
Yeah, I know. I think maybe I'll start by giving a bit of context on Phillip Morris and our climate risk assessment that we have done. So periodically we do what we call a CCRO, so it's a climate change risk and opportunity assessment, where we look across our whole value chain and try to understand what are the biggest risks to our business from climate change. And the results of that assessment that we have done show that the biggest risks to us are overwhelmingly in our supply chain. And they relate to increasing likelihood of floods in our tobacco supply chain, so in Latin America and Asia Pacific typically. This is also something that can impact our logistics operations. And then we also have the risk of increasing droughts, not just in our tobacco supply chain, but across all of the materials that we procure. And so this is an assessment where we look at the short-term, medium-term, and long-term in different temperature scenarios. So we do an assessment in a 1.5 degree scenario, 2 and a 3. And what's interesting is that when we look at these risks, it's not something we see in a far distant long-term time horizon where we see that likelihood coming. It's in the short-term horizon as well. And if you read our integrated report, last year we were having to resource from one geographic region of the world to another, just because the availability of crop in one region, we didn't have the right quantity nor the quality that we needed. And part of that was driven by extreme weather events. So this is something that we already see and we monitor very closely today. Yeah.
Can I add something?
Absolutely.
So as a banker, from our perspective, we have a reasonable trade finance portfolio that cuts across a number of African countries. And what was going through my head as you started that conversation was drought and flooding, because that has a direct impact typically on that country that we're facing with, and the rating and how much we're willing to do on it. And we're seeing increased volatility in those measures, and you see it coming out in terms of the impact it has on their macros, such as reserve positions that these countries have. So it's a real threat that we see in some of the activity that we do, and where some of our counterparties are ultimately based.
And similarly, in the UK, and a lot of our customer base is kind of UK and Europe, but from wherever you are in a supply chain, if there's extreme weather activity somewhere else, it's going to have a material effect on the knock-on of the ability of goods and services to move over borders. So, wherever this starts and wherever the major challenges in terms of the evolving risk comes, it's going to affect all businesses.
Absolutely.
And I think within that, actually, what all three of you guys were saying is actually it's about risk awareness as well. So we have an office in Istanbul in Turkey, and I was chatting with one of our Turkish banking clients over there, and they bank strawberry farmers, tomato farmers in Antalya. Antalya as a region is getting hit by climate change. It's getting hotter and hotter. So, if you are farming these things, then it, at some point in time, will become increasingly difficult to grow those crops, which means that actually if you are relying on sending strawberries to Tesco or Sainsbury's here in the UK, you are going to have your revenue shrinking over time because you just can't produce as many, just what you said about having to switch suppliers for quality and crops. So if someone who's running a business is more aware of climate risk and things to do, they can start to mitigate. We talk about transition. Transition doesn't happen overnight. It takes time to plan. But, thinking about, can I relocate some of my business? Can I take some of my profits today and start to have a strawberry farm somewhere that is less likely? Those things will deliver better resilience, which means that a loan that a bank might make over 5 years, they might look and go, well, actually, I won't make 5-year loans to businesses that are not ESG aware because they won't be around to pay me back. So I think that sort of time horizon, debt is usually a long-term instrument. I mean, I know it can be very short-term working capital, but if someone's lending money for 5 years, 10 years, they need to be confident that person is going to pay them back. And if their business is likely to be affected and they don't know, they're a much worse risk. And I think that's changing in what we're seeing of large organisations, from buyers or bankers or insurers to actually who's in front of me. And I think there's so much there.
I think one other thing to that point, which is quite interesting, a lot of large organisations, financial institutions, international corporations think in decades. They're really thinking ahead. It can be quite strategic. The average age of a small business in Europe is 8.5 years. So actually, a lot of the time that sort of doesn't tie up with the nature of smaller businesses in the supply chain. And I think secondly, to Rupert's point, I think what's key in the next sort of moving maybe from risk to opportunity is business model innovation. To your point, moving to a sort of post-tobacco world is brilliant. And if there's ways that you can transition, the work that you do now into more sustainable activities, then that's great. And similarly, every business, many businesses now are not going to be able to do the work that they do today because of the nature of the future environment that we're going to live in. And that can be really scary, but unless you get to it now.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting position because where we're starting to get into is what does the future look like? How do we manage to navigate towards that? And we need to understand our entire ecosystem and their vulnerabilities within this, which we started to talk on. But what's lost with the mandatory reporting conversation and the moving beyond, and is found in the beyond compliance, is how do we move organisations with us along this? What's the responsibility of larger organisations in driving this? How do we educate our stakeholders? Does anybody want to chime in with some information?
Yeah, I can jump in there. It's interesting. So I think there's been a lot of discussion about smaller organisations and how they can manage, because they don't have the resources that larger ones do. And I was at an event last week in Switzerland with a bunch of small and medium-sized enterprises saying that some of the challenges that they face are they often can't access the talent to come work for them. Often their offices are kind of outside of a sort of city centre, so talent is an issue, and budget. They don't have the budget to hire large consultancies, even smaller niche consultancies. And so there's a big discussion around this. And then at the same time, on the other side of the table, you have huge organisations like Phillip Morris, who, and at many events like this and kind of Climate Week, you hear a lot people saying the challenge of decarbonising Scope 3 for big organisations is huge. And a lot of organisations now are developing supplier engagement programs to really address and try and engage with their suppliers. What that looks like at Phillip Morris is we have developed a sustainability accelerator, and what we are doing there is kind of an engineer-to-engineer model. So for the last several years, we have had a lot of success in decarbonising our own operations, so our own Scope 1 and 2. We have declined absolute emissions by 39% versus our 2019 baseline. In that process, we have built a lot of capabilities internally. We've had a lot of learnings about how to install low-carbon technology in your manufacturing centres. And so we're taking the people that have done that for us in our operations. They are now working in the Sustainability Accelerator, and they are going out and running customized workshops with some of our key suppliers, really to build up their capabilities and share those learnings. And so one thing I would say is, if you're a small to medium enterprise and you're B2B, go out and speak to your customers about what are those engagement programs that they have. Because yesterday there was a lady from a massive drinks manufacturer. They have a similar program across the industry. So all of the large soft drink manufacturers have gotten together to develop a similar program. In the pharmaceutical and healthcare space, I know that there's similar stuff. So the big multinationals now are really recognizing that need of SMEs and really building these engagement programs.
Can I just jump in on? So amazing to hear what you do. Any support for small businesses and good is great. There is a flip side of that, and if you're a small business and you work with, let's say, 10 large enterprises, and each one of you is asking for you for slightly different bits of information with slightly different reporting and different boundaries and different methodologies, and there's a million questionnaires, it can be really challenging. One thing which I think is really encouraging at Climate Week, on Monday at Parliament, Business for Net Zero alongside the Broadway Initiative launched the UK voluntary SME reporting standard. Now this has sort of scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. It has a bunch of other high level, I think there's 12 questions in it. And the ask to business and the general community is, can all the big corporates use this standard to ask your suppliers for the same data in the same way at the same time? And I think it's happening. There's a really good groundswell of this, and actually it's not only there, but I think a lot of these, obviously this panel is a lot about what's beyond compliance, but sometimes actually when the compliance gets in the way, they've got to get that done so that they can move on to actually taking action.
100%.
Yeah, and actually I ran a workshop upstairs yesterday where it was a little bit of sort of like putting a challenge out there, how are people dealing with it? And one of the challenges we saw was actually a media firm that had one sustainability officer in it. So quite a big firm to have one sustainability officer in such industry. And she was saying she struggles to respond to all the different formats of questionnaires that come in because they have one sustainability capability, which is what it is at that point in time. But they have so many different buyers asking for a slight twist on it, which has been given to them by a consultant. And we were sort of talking about Carbon Commons yesterday, actually, George, which is a fantastic initiative. And if you haven't read up about it, do. Because it's something that... Oh, sorry. Do. read up on Carbon Commons, so I dropped my mic there. Because actually it is about, let's not compete on standards, let's compete on the things we do with the data, right? And I think there are major challenges, and a lot of consulting firms have gone, I can give you incrementally better insight, Nicole, for example, if you just ask these 3 extra questions. But the time impact it has on the small business, as George is saying, is actually disproportionately affecting them because they don't have a person to respond to it. And actually, we shouldn't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And actually, if everybody is focusing on a dozen, 20, it doesn't really matter what they are. Europe has a few more. And I think the UK version has really leveraged from a lot of the good work that Europe has done around VSME. We're in a much better place because, in Turkey, where I spend a lot of time because we have a business there, actually the gorilla of supply chain sustainability measurement is a big private equity owned French headquartered business. I won't name them by particularly, but they're not affordable either to the big corporates in Turkey or the suppliers. And they have their own proprietary standard which they are imposing and monetizing, and for them, very good. But actually, you won't solve the problem if you are not affordable. And again, large parts of supply chains are from emerging and developing nations who don't have the money or the resources to do these things. So I think standards actually of what we want to know, what really matters, coming back to materiality, it will vary by sector because what's important to tobacco is different to banking, is different to software, but there will be some common things. I think supporting standards as much as possible will also help enormously.
Yeah, absolutely. You just started to touch on it there, and I'm really interested in discussing these global forces for change that we're starting to see. We spoke about the beyond compliance being beyond the sort of politicisation of ESG, if you like, in certain markets fluctuating potentially falsely at the moment, because we know that insurance and finance are really setting their sights on what is a risk, and we know that climatic impacts are an inevitability and so therefore a risk. Can we talk a little bit, does anybody want to add any context to this pause that we've seen as there's been a retraction from a delay in the mandatory reporting obligation? Does anybody want to talk on this division over time that will be found in the business as usual versus those moving beyond compliance, for instance? Rupert?
I think actually you made a very interesting point, the pause. In very few countries, with the exception of executive orders in the US, which the US doesn't operate the same sort of legal system as many other parts of the world.
Or sanity.
Yeah, well, that's a different story, but I won't. But actually, the laws haven't been rolled back, and in fact, new net zero laws are going in. They went live in the UAE at the end of May. So I think, generally speaking, there is a concept of a pause. Someone said to me that Donald Trump is master of the earwaves. He's really good at capturing people's attention, and to some extent, he is broadcasting what is frustration in many different ways. And focusing some of that on the costs of getting to net zero, or actually I think in America it's been more about DE&I and how that's impacting the thought about meritocracy in America. So I'm not going to dive into that, but I think what's interesting is that in most of the rest of the world we haven't rolled back from our net zero commitments. New net zero commitments are going in, and therefore there is a legal requirement for countries and companies within them to continue. So I think what's happening is the media is not really helping because it's rebroadcasting the airwaves,
Yeah.
but actually the legal obligations haven't changed. The need to do it is still there, and actually all the advisors, the accountants, things like that, actually need to get on and tell their clients that this is something that hasn't gone away. Right? And so I think we're in a sort of funny place where actually it hasn't gone away, but it feels like it's gone away, which means that people are taking the time to pause. Now, the pause bit is interesting because, as you said earlier, the banks and the insurers are identifying that those who are pausing are a worse risk because of things like, do you not know you're going to be flooded? And so I think what will happen is quite quickly people will start to see access to finance, access to insurance, access to bank accounts will be determined by it. And then they work out it's because they haven't done anything, you'll see a catch up. But I think the key bit is at the moment, tell people why it's important and work with those who get it early, because they will actually be, I think what we're seeing is those who are committed are still committed and leaning in and really trying to make a difference. Where they need help is explaining how it's driving the business forward in a business context. And if you can say to an FD, to a CFO, if you have one, this is making my business better. Marks and Spencer's got shut down by a cyber attack. They lost $100 million. Cyber is one of the pillars of ESG, right, under G. So I think, again, it's just keep it focused on business benefits, and the money will keep flowing to do it, I think, is what I'm sensing.
Maybe just touching on that as well, the business case for sustainability has never been stronger. Like the economics of it have not changed at all with the politicisation of net zero. There was an interesting announcement from Greg Jackson at Octopus at the start of this week, where Octopus have now got this tariff where you can use your car to power your house, two-way charger at home, and it didn't get much publicity, but actually from my perspective, if they can roll that out to say 100,000 cars, they've got a grid system which can play in and out of the national grid network. These are technologies that are coming now. And what he's saying is you can have a free car, or you can have very cheap energy, depending on what way you look at it. You just got to plug your car in and enable that to be used as a battery for the grid. These kind of technologies are coming on. Batteries are getting cheaper. Solar's getting cheaper. One of the biggest challenges from an SME perspective is that a lot of SMEs don't want to take on the risk of debt. And there's a huge that needs government intervention, but they're fully aware that that's coming down the pipe. So I think to your point on the pause, yes, but no.
Exactly. But I think we start to see a divide in those organisations that are not continuing and those that may fall behind. And my fear with that is that the divide will be the small to medium-sized businesses that, as you say, don't want to take on the debt and therefore end up with an increased risk and an inability to catch up. So that's really my concern. I've been given the 10-minute signal, so before I ask another question, I just want to see if there are questions in the audience. Can you pop hands up if anybody has any immediate questions? Not right now. Okay. Just to also say that somebody didn't storm off from our stage. We had we've all sort of double booked this week because it's London Climate Action Week, so he had to go off and join another panel. So one of the things I'm really curious about is how we address the stakeholder issue. So I know this isn't sort of something that we discussed talking about, but I'm really interested in how we're seeing that stakeholder issue addressed. So if our value in the future is going to be always based in geography and stakeholders and industry, I think the methods currently largely are insufficient in actually getting to the root of those problems. You mentioned questionnaires, they're brilliant, but do they actually get to the depth of it? Do you have any experience, any of you, that you'd like to add into that, if stakeholders are the value?
I think something we believe in personally is data is a very powerful enabler, and it's a powerful enabler in many different ways. You obviously have to have enough data to use to drive change. One of the things we're doing is profiling the ESG exhaust that everybody leaves of businesses in that sort of 5 to 100 million turnover, who are the ones who are least resourced and typically doing the least. The profiling is based upon real data, where real data exists, and it's then extrapolated based upon sector and size and revenue and other factors. If you present someone with this is how you look, then actually people are much more able to comment on something. I think one of the challenges of carbon and sustainability in general is people can't visualize it. We as human beings are visual creatures, right? So actually, if you can paint a picture, people tend to respond to a picture rather than just words. So I think what we're doing is painting pictures, allowing this picture to be presented to people, and people go, yeah, that looks like me. I am a low intensity 50-person media business. I don't do much business travel. That feels about right. Or it doesn't feel right, because actually I spend my whole time on the plane coming backwards and forwards to Reset Connect or whatever it is. So I think giving people a chance to reflect on that and then change and adjust is actually a much better way to get people engaged. It also removes the invisibility of the ostrich syndrome. People often in smaller firms don't do anything because they don't believe anybody can see them doing anything. So if you remove the magic invisibility cloak, actually, and show people that they can be seen, then actually very often business owners are competitive people. They don't want to be bottom quarter. Certainly not if everyone else can see that they're bottom quarter. So I think that's kind of where we're starting from.
And I think data is very important. And to understand where your risks are, the progress you're making, you obviously need very robust data. The question in terms of stakeholders, for me, ultimately, climate change and all the things that we're talking about, it's a human problem. You need human beings to solve the problem. And so when you're trying to build resilience, for example, in your supply chain, you can use data to understand where is it that I have risks, and you can go and measure that risk. And then you go on the ground and you say, okay, we have a risk of a drought here. We need to implement a solution. And for that, you need to engage with the local stakeholders on the ground, those smallholder farming communities who you're going to rely on to develop that program. So, to give you an example, in our supply chain, we have areas in India where we source tobacco leaf that the issue on the ground in India is the variability of rain. So you have a monsoon season, you have a lot of rain, and then you have a dry season, you have less rain. And so you have a risk that during that dry season you have a drought and then you're not getting water to the crop, right? We are working on the ground with tobacco farmers in India to build these ponds that act like temporary reservoirs so they can capture the rain in the wet season, and then that bridges that dry season for them. We rely on them to maintain those reservoirs. We work with them on the ground to understand what their challenges are to maintain those. And we need to do that if we want to build that resilience in our supply chain. And so I think the data allowed us to identify the risks that we're having, but really it's that engagement and that constant and frequent engagement. It's not something you do off, you have a materiality assessment which tells you need to engage with stakeholders, and so you go and do that. No, it's a continuous process that you need to have throughout your operations and your supply chain.
Maybe one quick point on data before I get to your point. Someone said something earlier this week which I really liked, which was more data, less reporting. I think that's really kind of key. Is like how do we enable the data to flow, and from a sort of stakeholder management perspective at Sage, we've got kind of people and planet as our two sort of pillars in our sustainability strategy, and I think what's really important actually, and what I've seen work really well, whether you're a small business or a large business, in order to make a difference for your stakeholders and your wider community as a business, you have to make the senior leaders accountable, and you have to actually make their bonuses accountable, and you have to make their OKRs and their objective frameworks accountable. And we're seeing that in Sage, and it's having a really material effect on our ability to get stuff done, because the business is actually formally committed to making this work. And I'd like to see a lot more of that in large businesses, because it doesn't come up a lot as a topic. We all say we want to do stuff, but actually when we talk about putting something on the CEO's bonus, it seems to be a topic that's a little bit tentative.
I'll chip in there. So we have probably 2021 or 2, I recall my time, we developed what we call a sustainability index. And so this is an index of 16 KPIs. Each KPI is linked to one of our strategies, be that our business transformation, so how fast are we phasing out cigarettes, how many markets are we present with our smoke-free products? Those are some of the metrics. We also have metrics on climate, metrics on kind of human rights topics. And all of this is linked to our executives' compensation, to their long-term compensation. So 30% of the long-term compensation is linked to the performance of the sustainability index, and it is a huge driver.
That's good to hear.
But actually equally, again, I think that's something that big companies are much better at than medium-sized companies. So in my workshop yesterday was a board advisor to AIM-listed businesses. Now, in the UK, AIM is the junior market. It's sort of semi-listed is one way of thinking about it. So it has a small amount of reporting obligations, but not the same as a full listing. So what you see is some sectors are much better at disclosing voluntarily metrics because it's a competitive advantage. So the industrial sector is much better actually than the energy sector. The energy sector tends to green hush, even though actually it's critical to transformation in that mid-market. Which means actually that if it's a competitive advantage, it's easier to tie a bonus to it, because actually you will lose business if you do not things that are competitive, right? But I think not enough people are thinking that way about where does it give me a differentiator. And actually, you mentioned stakeholders. The most important stakeholders are going to be your customers, because actually a business only has two levers: revenues and costs, right? So if you don't have revenues, well, and investors if you're in an early stage scale up, right? But effectively, the fundamental rule of a business is don't run out of cash. And the only way to not run out of cash is to impress clients or impress investors who keep you funded until you get through, both of whom are larger organizations typically who are beginning to think about it. But I think one of the challenges that I see generally is the venture capital industry, which is putting capital into a lot of the early stage scale-ups, actually doesn't really prioritize it at an early stage because they're thinking they're not going to survive. Coming back to your point about, if a company doesn't survive 8.5 years, why would I embed it early? So I think there's still a degree of it's a cost, not a benefit to do so in the mind of smaller investors. So I think there is still a need to educate, again, business benefits. If you can demonstrate it's a business benefit, going and doing ISO 27001 makes you enterprise ready, means you earn more business, it's a cost that you can justify, and it's part of sustainability. These things actually help. So I think there's not one single answer, but I do think that actually making it clear what is accountable to running your business will make it easier to put it into bonuses or compensation. I think smaller businesses, there is no bonus. The business has surplus at the end of the year, CEO is happy, right? So things that can help that. Later stage, I think it is probably about ownership at the board level, because actually if there's not ownership at the board level, it won't happen because the CEO and the CFO will be on short-term financial incentives and the KPIs won't be there. So I think it does require the consultants actually to play a part in that as well, I think.
Agree. And I think we're starting to see the realisation that this is a board responsibility. Certainly I sit on a lot of legal panels for the legal sector, and the realisation of that responsibility element of it is sitting very clearly around litigation and potential, and not just litigation from compliance, but litigation from stakeholders for not doing what you say you're doing. And we're definitely seeing that element of boards taking ownership of that. And I would say any organisation to feedback, I have a membership for leaders in sustainability, and largely we will see a consensus that the biggest block to driving greater sustainable change is a board that doesn't have a knowledge maturity around sustainability and therefore a responsibility. I like that to sit with the FD. Others, it will sit with chief exec, or actuaries are brilliant as well in this space. So I'm very conscious of time, are there any questions? We could have one quick one. If not, I would love final words from each one on the panel, please. Nicole, did you want to?
Yeah, I can
final
start.
Reflection.
I think just of a kind of reflection, I think we spoke a lot about data, a lot about risk management, and I think often when we speak about sustainability, we do talk about it in these terms, and it's an engineering problem, it's a data collection problem, but ultimately I think we're at a bit of a pivotal turning point when we talk about sustainability, where we need to recognize that it is a systems problem, and we need to address it as a systems level issue, with human beings at the center of it, and make sure that when we are discussing this, we are bringing everyone to the table, meaning we are bringing policymakers, we are bringing academics, we are bringing civil society, we are bringing our suppliers along, we are bringing all kinds of companies, and like you said earlier, there's good companies, bad companies. We need to move beyond this and identify what are those solutions that work for the greatest number of people in society, and how can we collectively as human beings scale up those solutions with the right policies, the right incentives. And so I think we need to a little bit move beyond this discussion of compliance, data, engineering solutions, and really put humans back at the core in a really constructive way and have that dialogue.
Yeah, maybe just riffing off your data point, it is all about data, but it's only about data to the point where businesses can take action and transition, whether that's a business model, whether that's lower carbon, whether that's more socially responsible or otherwise. And maybe just a little plug from our perspective, if you are a small business and you want a tool, we have a tool that works for climate action. There's also many other tools. I'd just say go and do something. right? Take action, and if you're not the responsible person for taking action, go and talk to the person who's responsible. It's on everybody in this room to be personally responsible for moving forward the transition to a clean economy, to better business. And if you think it's not, then you're part of the problem.
There's not much more to say. I think it is, businesses are run by people, and actually people are motivated by things. Data helps drive action. I think we're all agreeing on that, and I think it is, but it is about action. So I think the key bit is, do you always be looking for what you can do, and it is actually making a difference to your business, making it more resilient, helping it grow, and think about it in that way. I often say that actually the worst thing you can do to an FD is put Greta Thunberg in front of them, right? They just don't emotionally understand where she's coming from. And those who do have already done it. So actually we need to engage those who have not yet engaged. So we need to find ways to engage with them on their terms, because you can't expect them to be like us. So I think that's what we're all trying to do, is help people who are perhaps skeptical by default to engage, and I think the engagement is the most important piece. Anyway.
I think maybe just one final point off Rupert. We do need the activists, people like Greta, breaking things. Like, we absolutely need that. They're fundamental. We also need the people, maybe more like us, who are engaging and at the heart of it, and everything in between. Everyone's got a role to play. So whatever your persona, however you see the world, however you play into it, just do what you can.
Absolutely.
In a constructive way with a lot of dialogue.
Agreed. And when necessary, breaking things.
On that, I would say for homework, if anybody wants it, to just go away and think about how we are dependent. Very often we talk in sustainability around our impacts, our opportunities, our risks. When the conversation gets really interesting is when we start to really unpick our dependencies on the natural world. So pull on those threads and start to understand the natural capital that's involved in all of the things that you purchase and in business that you're trying to have. Really understand how we don't exist in silo without that natural systems that we're so dependent on. Thank you so much. It's been such an incredibly interesting conversation, and I look forward to more of it. Thanks very much.